Hey everyone, and welcome back to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're stepping away from the grand tapestries of battles and coronations to explore something a little quieter, a bit more herbal. We're about to take a slow, sleepy trip into the foggy, fragrant, and often misunderstood world of medieval intoxication. It's a side of history that was rarely written down in official chronicles, but was whispered about in apothecaries, brewed in quiet monasteries, and grown in the hidden corners of castle gardens. So, find a comfortable spot and let's begin our journey. But before we drift off into the past, if you enjoy these quiet explorations of history, please consider showing your support by subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes and leaving a like on the video. It truly helps our channel find other history lovers just like you. I'm always so fascinated to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so feel free to share that in the comments below. It's wonderful to see our little community of night owls span the entire globe. Alright? Now is the time to dim the lights. Perhaps you have a fan whirring softly in the background, or the gentle sound of rain tapping against your window. Settle in, get comfortable, and allow your mind to unwind. We aren't here to study for an exam. We're here to simply drift through time together. Let the worries of the modern world fade away as we journey back to an era when the lines between medicine, magic, and madness were beautifully, and sometimes dangerously, blurred. It's incredibly easy to picture the Middle Ages as a perpetually gray landscape, a dreary, mud-caked parade of solemn monks, relentless plagues, and the occasional, clunky joust. But beneath the heavy wool cloaks and the ever-present shadow of hardship, there were ordinary people. They were real, curious, and sometimes profoundly experimental. These were individuals who, facing a world of constant pain and deep uncertainty, might look at a strange, gnarled root and have the thought, well, I wonder what might happen if I were to boil this in wine. And in all honesty, who could possibly blame them? This was an era devoid of electricity, of modern anesthetics, and of the simple, warming comfort of a hot cup of coffee. Daily entertainment might consist of watching the local blacksmith hammer a single nail for an hour, or speculating whether your neighbor's persistent cough was just a cold or the coming of the Black Death. So, if a wandering herbalist told you there was a flower that could make you forget the crushing weight of the feudal system for just one afternoon, you'd likely be tempted to try it, too. Contrary to how we might view it today, the concept of using substances to alter one's own consciousness wasn't always hidden in the shadows. It was often woven directly into the fabric of society itself. But it was very rarely, if ever, called getting high. There were no medieval equivalents of stoner comedies. Instead, these experiences were cloaked in much more acceptable and often spiritual terms: visionary states, divine inspiration, profound pain relief, or, when things went terribly wrong, it was simply blamed on demonic possession. The range of intoxicants available to the medieval person went far beyond a simple tankard of ale, though that certainly played its important part. The medieval world was a wild, natural pharmacy of plants that could induce a deep sleep, seeds that promised prophetic and vivid dreams, flowers that could blur one's vision into a beautiful watercolor painting, and fungi that could make a person believe they were speaking directly to a saint. And most famously, there were the mysterious ointments, whispered to give witches the incredible power of flight. This wasn't a party. It was a journey into the unknown. In the medieval world, you didn't need a clandestine meeting in a dark alley or a secret password to acquire mind-altering substances. All you really needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and perhaps a healthy disregard for precise measurements. Nature herself was the primary dealer, and her inventory was vast, potent, and scattered across every forest, field, and monastery herb patch. She wasn't always gentle, and her products came with no instruction manual. Medieval Europe was practically overflowing with plants, fungi, and resins that could either cure your throbbing headache or make you believe that you had just been elected king of the squirrels. The line between medicine and a mystical journey was, let us say, artistically interpreted. Learned physicians, devout monks, village midwives, and wandering herbalists all practiced a form of botany with varying levels of formal training, but a great deal of practical, and sometimes very risky, enthusiasm. Let us begin with a classic of the medieval herbal toolkit. Henbane. This unassuming plant, known to botanists as Hyoscyamus niger, was the medieval equivalent of a mysterious button with a small, handwritten sign that reads, "Let's see what happens." It was a staple of the era's unofficial pharmacy, a plant that promised either a serene slumber or a frantic one-sided argument with a nearby fence post. Its reputation was formidable, and its effects were the stuff of legend. Henbane wasn't just some casual weed, it was a powerful mood shaper. Monks carefully recorded its properties in their beautifully illustrated herbals, and physicians used it as a powerful sedative. In small, carefully prepared doses, it could soothe a raging toothache, bring on a much-needed sleep for the insomniac, and make the harrowing experience of childbirth just a little less traumatic. In short, it was the medieval version of being told to take 2 of these and try not to scream. But in larger doses, or for someone with the wrong constitution, henbane could introduce a person to an entirely new universe of problems. The herb could trigger a state of wild delirium, vivid hallucinations, and extreme agitation. Its active compounds could make your medieval brain get very strange very fast. Visual distortions, a powerful thirst, and complete disorientation were common, as were spontaneous outbursts of what could only be described as interpretive dance, or a sincere, heartfelt conversation with a bucket you were convinced was your deceased grandmother. This potent effect comes from alkaloids like scopolamine and hyoscyamin, which interfere with the neurotransmitters in the brain, essentially disrupting the normal flow of information. Henbane was most often brewed into teas, but its leaves could also be smoked or, more ominously, combined with animal fat and smeared onto the skin as part of a potent ointment. This was a popular delivery method for anyone who preferred their consciousness to be arranged in a less linear, more abstract fashion. So, was it legal to possess? Technically, yes. The concept of a controlled substance simply didn't exist yet. However, it was deeply controversial, especially with the Church. Any substance that so powerfully altered perception was viewed with intense suspicion. Visions, after all, were supposed to come from God, not from a common garden shrub. Still, henbane was widely used, and it even found its way into some beer recipes before being banned in Germany in the 16th century in favor of a much safer and less hallucinatory additive, hops. Few plants in the medieval world were as feared, as revered, and as dramatically misunderstood as the mandrake. This was a root so potent and so bizarrely human-shaped that it sparked a mixture of botany, folklore, and sheer panic. Known to herbalists as Mandragora officinarum, the mandrake was associated with deep sleep, powerful hallucinations, fertility, and a high probability of either experiencing a mystical vision or simply waking up in a ditch next to a very confused goat. Either way, when you dealt with mandrake, something was bound to happen. Medieval herbalists were convinced that the root, which often had a stubby, contorted shape resembling a small human figure, contained immense magical and medicinal properties. It was a powerful sedative, a primitive anesthetic, and a reputed aphrodisiac. According to some texts, it was a direct conduit to the world of prophetic dreams. You could boil it in wine to calm the excruciating pain of setting a broken bone, or you could simply inhale its fumes and find yourself immediately questioning all of your previous life choices. But the true fame of the mandrake, the detail that lodged it firmly in the medieval imagination, came from its alleged habit of screaming when it was pulled from the earth. Yes, screaming, a shriek so piercing, so otherworldly, that legend claimed the sound alone was lethal. Medieval texts are filled with solemn warnings that to simply hear the mandrake's cry as it left the soil could instantly kill any man, woman, or child who was unfortunate enough to be within earshot. This rather serious occupational hazard naturally led to some very creative harvesting techniques. The most famous, and certainly the most cited, involved tying one end of a rope to the root of the plant and the other end to a dog, often a black dog, for extra dramatic flair. The harvester would then walk a safe distance away and call the animal as the poor dog pulled the root from the ground. It would supposedly bear the full force of the deadly scream. The assumption was that the dog would perish, but you would be left with your magical root, a plan that raises a few ethical red flags, even by medieval standards. Once the root was safely harvested, and the dog was presumably mourned, the mandrake could be dried, powdered, or steeped in wine or oil. Small, humanoid figures carved from the root, known as mandragoras, were sometimes carried in pouches. These were believed to ward off evil spirits, ensure victory in battle, or promote fertility. After all, nothing says romance quite like carrying around a mummified, screaming root that has seen things you can only imagine. The church, predictably, did not love the mandrake. Anything that caused powerful visions and wasn't directly tied to an organized religious experience was treated as best suspicious and at worst witchcraft adjacent. Yet, in a classic medieval contradiction, it was often monks who were carefully recording mandrake recipes in their monastery herbals, complete with suspiciously detailed instructions for its use. It seems that even within the walls of the cloister, practical knowledge sometimes trumped official dogma. Ultimately, the mandrake was a perfect symbol of the medieval relationship with nature's pharmacy. Used correctly, it could dull the pain of surgery, treat chronic insomnia, or create vivid dreams that were considered prophetic. Used incorrectly, however, it could cause vomiting, unconsciousness, or a reaction so bizarre that it might lead your family to stage an exorcism. All because you were insisting that your soup was whispering ancient secrets to you in Latin. It was a powerful tool, but one that always demanded respect. Let's imagine you were a medieval noblewoman, hoping to make an impression at a royal feast. You could wear your finest linen dress, or braid rare wildflowers into your hair. Or, if you were truly committed to the aesthetic, you could drip a carefully prepared tincture of literal poison into your eyes. It is time for us to meet belladonna, also known by the much more direct and honest name, deadly nightshade. Its scientific name, Atropa belladonna, sounds like the final boss in a medieval fantasy game, and in many ways, it was. The name belladonna itself translates from Italian to beautiful lady, and this was for a very specific reason. For centuries, women used an extract from the plant as a cosmetic. When a few drops were applied to the eyes, the plant's powerful alkaloids caused the pupils to dilate dramatically. In an era before sunglasses, these wide, dark, almost liquid-looking eyes were considered alluring, mysterious, and perhaps a sign of a sensitive and passionate nature. Of course, the rather significant downside was severely blurred vision and an extreme sensitivity to light. But beauty standards have never been particularly known for their practicality. But cosmetics were just one of belladonna's many talents. Beyond its use in the pursuit of beauty, it was a potent medicinal herb. It was used as a painkiller, a muscle relaxant to treat spasms and convulsions, and an aid for sleep. It also found its way into some very questionable recipes, occasionally being used as a so-called truth serum, though the truth it was likely to produce was often along the lines of a detailed confession that the sky was made of blueberry jam and was currently whispering secrets to the nearby chickens. Like henbane, the plant contains the potent compounds atropine and scopolamine, which powerfully disrupt the central nervous system. The effects could range from mildly trippy to a full-blown hallucinatory experience, leaving the user wondering why the patterns on the wallpaper were suddenly vibrating, or why the saints painted on the church fresco had started to offer them unsolicited life advice. It was a journey into a strange, unpredictable, and often unsettling landscape of the mind. And yet, despite all its uses, one must never forget its other name, deadly nightshade. The shiny black berries of the plant looked deceptively sweet and inviting, especially to curious children, but they were lethally toxic. The difference between a dose that caused visions and a dose that caused death was frighteningly small. This made belladonna a notorious poison throughout history, used for quiet assassinations and tragic accidents alike. Every medieval herbalist who handled it knew they were working with a plant that demanded the utmost respect. Because of its sheer potency, belladonna was a star ingredient in many of the most legendary concoctions of the Middle Ages, particularly those infamous flying ointments that we have mentioned before. When it was blended with other powerful herbs like henbane and mandrake and mixed into a base of animal fat, it created a psychoactive salve of incredible power. This was not a simple tea for sleep. This was a gateway to another reality, and belladonna was one of the primary keys that unlocked the door. So, belladonna existed in this strange medieval space between cosmetics, medicine, and outright poison. Physicians and apothecaries used it, sometimes carefully, and sometimes, depending on how bad the plague was that week, perhaps a bit recklessly. It appears in herbals, in recipes for love charms, and in the court records for poisonings across Europe. Medieval self-care was a bold business indeed, and using belladonna was perhaps the boldest move of all, a high-stakes gamble for beauty, for healing, or for a brief, terrifying glimpse into the abyss. Before modern edibles came in discreet, neatly labeled packages with precise dosages, medieval people were already getting quite inventive with their methods of consumption. They just weren't using chocolate or fruity gummies. Instead, they relied on a strange and wonderful world of ointments, balms, tinctures, and potions. And let's be clear, the word ointment rarely inspires confidence, especially when some of the more esoteric medieval recipes call for ingredients like belladonna, poppy, and other more symbolic additions. all to be stirred under a specific phase of the moon. It's important to remember that these powerful concoctions were rarely, if ever, created for a casual weekend buzz. Many were deeply tied to specific rituals, folk medicine traditions, and intense spiritual experiences. The goal might be to knock a patient unconscious before a crude surgery, to send a mystic into an ecstatic trance to commune with the divine, or, if misused, to make a person firmly believe that they were slowly turning into a wolf. The intention was often profound, even if the eventual result was profoundly strange. The application of these substances was often topical, which might sound safer than drinking a mysterious potion. However, medieval herbalists seemed to understand something about absorption that is often overlooked. To get the most potent effect from a salve, it was not just rubbed on the arm or leg. The preferred points of application were the mucous membranes of the body, areas where the skin is thinnest and the bloodstream is most accessible. This method ensured a rapid and powerful delivery of the psychoactive compounds directly into the system. This brings us to the most infamous of all these creations, the so-called flying ointments, which are so closely associated with the lore of witches. These were typically a potent blend of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and sometimes other powerful herbs like wolfsbane or poppy, all mixed into a base of animal fat. The intended goal was to produce a euphoric, out-of-body sensation of flying through the night sky. The likely result was either a transcendent astral journey from the comfort of your own bed, or simply waking up in a haystack with absolutely no memory of how you got there. Beyond the salves, medieval potions were often consumed in a liquid base that could mask the bitter taste of the herbs. This was usually wine, ale, or a thick broth that probably smelled faintly of regret. Apothecaries and the infirmaries of monasteries were known to mix extracts of the opium poppy with spiced wine, creating a combination strong enough to numb a patient during the amputation of a limb, or perhaps to give them a front row seat to a divine revelation that they had never actually asked for. And we mustn't forget the elixirs that were sold by wandering quacks. These traveling pharmacists would roll into a village, promising to cure everything from a broken heart to the plague itself, often using secret family recipes that could also, with a slight adjustment, dissolve a leather shoe. Did these remedies actually work? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were just so intoxicating that they made you temporarily forget what was wrong with you in the first place, which, in the harsh reality of the Middle Ages, often counted as a success. The true magic and the true danger of these medieval preparations was that no one could ever quite predict the outcome. The potency of the plants varied wildly by season and soil, and measurements were based on a pinch or a handful. Would you sleep peacefully for 3 days? Would you commune with angels and learn the secrets of the universe? Or would you spend the night screaming at the moon and swearing your eternal loyalty to a particularly interesting-looking turnip? In the medieval world, there was often only one way to find out. Let's talk for a moment about the broomstick. Today, it's an iconic, almost quaint symbol of the medieval witch, the stuff of fairy tales and Halloween costumes. But back then, this simple household tool came with a rather scandalous and surprisingly pharmacological backstory. Spoiler alert, the broomstick wasn't always used for sweeping the floor. Its legendary connection to witchcraft has deep chemical roots that are fascinating to uncover. As we've discussed, historical records, especially those written by suspicious and hostile inquisitors, describe witches using these powerful flying ointments. These were thick, trance-inducing salves made from plants like henbane, belladonna, and mandrake, all of which are dangerously toxic if eaten. Swallowing such a concoction would likely lead to a swift and agonizing death, not a magical flight through the starry sky. So, taking this medicine by mouth was simply out of the question. Instead, the ointment had to be applied topically to the body's mucous membranes for the most rapid and effective absorption. And this is where the broomstick, or, as some sources more delicately phrased it, an anointed staff, comes into the picture. The smooth wooden handle of a broom or a similar staff served as a convenient and effective tool, a vehicle for applying the potent ointment to areas of the body with the highest rates of absorption. It was certainly not a family-friendly technique, but it was remarkably effective from a pharmacological standpoint. Within minutes of this unique application, users reported intense and vivid hallucinations. They described soaring through the night sky, attending great feasts with supernatural beings, or simply hovering over their village like the world's most confused and disoriented drone. Of course, these were almost certainly chemically induced hallucinations, not actual flights. But in an age where medicine, magic, and mysticism all shared a space in the public imagination, these powerful visions were often taken as literal proof of consorting with dark forces. Now, while medieval Europe was busy applying poisonous pastes to broom handles and calling it air travel, something far more sophisticated was happening to the south and east. In the flourishing cities of the Islamic Golden Age, a different substance reigned supreme, one that was used with a remarkable degree of scholarly curiosity and spiritual intent. It is time for us to meet hashish. Derived from the potent resin of the cannabis plant, hashish was widely used in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. And unlike Europe's bitter teas and ointments that often smelled like spoiled laundry, Islamic cultures actually made their edibles taste good. Hashish was often consumed orally, mixed with honey, dates, spices, and nuts, creating pleasant confections. Its use wasn't just recreational, though that certainly happened. It was deeply tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, where practitioners believed it could help dissolve the ego and open the mind to deep divine contemplation. In fact, many famous Sufi poets and philosophers wrote about hashish with the kind of intense emotion and abstract metaphor that modern songwriters reserve for bad breakups. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Many Islamic rulers periodically tried to ban its use, fearing it led to laziness, moral decay, or people giggling too much during solemn prayers. Like most such bans throughout history, these efforts had a very limited rate of success among the general populace. The substance was even tied to the legendary Hashashin, the order of assassins, from which we get our modern word. The story that they used hashish to glimpse paradise before a deadly mission is almost certainly a myth, likely spread by their enemies. But it's a powerful example of how cannabis was already wrapped in a cloak of both mystique and suspicion. Meanwhile, back in Europe, most people were centuries away from understanding how to use cannabis without immediately setting something on fire or declaring it to be the devil's lettuce. When you picture a medieval cathedral, you likely imagine sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, the sound of solemn chanting echoing off stone walls, and that thick, almost otherworldly cloud of incense smoke wafting through the air like God's own personal fog machine. For centuries, this has been seen as a symbol of holiness, a way to send prayers up to the heavens. But what if that smoke was doing more than just carrying prayers? What if it had a little something extra? Let's start with the two heavy hitters of church incense, frankincense and myrrh. Both are fragrant resins harvested from trees on the Arabian Peninsula and in East Africa. For millennia, they were burned in churches, temples, and royal courts. Their official purpose was to cleanse the air of impurities, ward off evil spirits, and generally make everything smell slightly less like unwashed wool and damp straw, which was no small feat. But here is the fascinating twist. Modern scientific studies have shown that burning frankincense resin actually releases psychoactive compounds into the air, particularly one called insensyl acetate. This compound has been found to affect the limbic system in the brains of mammals, which governs emotions. To put it simply, it can act as a mild anti-anxiety agent, creating a feeling of calm and tranquility in those who inhale it. Now, imagine a poorly ventilated medieval chapel, which is to say, pretty much all of them. During a long service with continuous clouds of incense smoke, combined with potential fasting, dehydration, and the hypnotic drone of Gregorian chant, prolonged exposure could certainly cause a mild, tranquilizing effect. It wasn't uncommon for devout monks or parishioners to report spiritual visions or feelings of profound peace during these long services. While they would have credited divine inspiration, it's entirely possible some of them were just lightly buzzed from the holy smoke. But if incense was the subtle background music of medieval intoxication, there was one substance that was the loud, ever-present main event. If there was one thing medieval people could count on, besides high taxes and the occasional outbreak of plague, it was alcohol. Beer, ale, mead, wine, cider, you name it. Someone was brewing it in a wooden barrel behind their house, and more often than not, calling it medicine. And in a very real way, it was. Water from rivers and wells was often dangerously contaminated, frequently downstream from livestock or human waste. Sipping from a local stream was basically a game of intestinal roulette, so instead, people reached for something fermented. Small beer, a very low-alcohol brew, was the medieval equivalent of a sports drink. It was consumed daily by adults and children alike, not primarily to get drunk, but simply to stay hydrated and alive, albeit with a light, constant buzz. Of course, not all medieval alcohol was so tame. If you were wealthier, or simply had fewer plans for the afternoon, you might opt for stronger ale, sweet honey mead, or expensive imported wine. And in the monasteries, brewing beer was considered a sacred duty. Monks meticulously perfected their recipes, documented fermentation methods, and enthusiastically taste-tested the results for quality control. If salvation truly came in pints, the Benedictine monks were well ahead of the curve. Ultimately, alcohol was a great lifestyle enhancer. It was used to dull the pain of medieval dentistry, to treat a lingering case of melancholy, or simply to forget that you lived in a drafty hovel with 6 other people and one extremely judgmental chicken. The taverns and alehouses were the therapy offices and social clubs of the Middle Ages, where people drank to celebrate, to mourn, to gossip, and to occasionally invent entirely new dance moves that no one had asked for. It was the social and chemical glue of the era. Sometimes, getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a conscious decision made in a garden or an apothecary's shop. Sometimes, it was just breakfast. It is time for us to meet ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains. To the untrained medieval eye, it just looked like a slightly weird, blackened, purplish kernel mixed in with the rest of the harvest. To a modern scientist, it's a biological prank with a list of side effects that reads like a terrible medieval curse. This unassuming fungus was the source of what some historians have called the original unintentional LSD trip. This is because ergot contains powerful psychoactive alkaloids, the very compounds from which the chemist Albert Hofmann would first synthesize LSD centuries later. In parts of Europe with cold, damp climates, like France and Germany, rye was a staple crop, and ergot contamination was common. People baked their daily bread from this infected rye, simply because hunger often trumps fungus awareness. And so, entire villages would unknowingly ingest ergot-laced loaves, with spectacular and horrifying results. The resulting illness was so common it had a name, ergotism, though it was more popularly known as St. Anthony's fire. It came in two horrific forms. The first was convulsive ergotism, characterized by painful muscle spasms, violent seizures, and vivid, often terrifying hallucinations. The second was gangrenous ergotism, where the fungus's alkaloids constricted blood flow so severely that it caused an agonizing burning sensation in the limbs. This would lead to tissue death, with fingers, toes, and even entire limbs shriveling, turning black, and eventually falling off. Local outbreaks of ergotism led to some of the most bizarre events in medieval history, including the infamous dancing plagues. These were episodes where large groups of people would dance uncontrollably and frantically for days on end, sometimes until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion or even death. At the time, this was blamed on demonic possession, a divine curse, or a hotness of the blood. In reality, it may have simply been a mass case of convulsive ergotism, a village-wide terrifying trip set to a silent, maddening rhythm. Ironically, the monks of the Order of St. Anthony, who ran special hospitals to care for the afflicted, often inadvertently stumbled upon the cure. Their treatment frequently involved moving the victims away from their home village and providing them with charity. This charity often included bread baked from wheat, not rye. By simply changing the victim's diet, they removed the source of the poison, and the patients would miraculously recover, further cementing the saint's reputation for miraculous healing. So, did the average medieval person ever connect the dots between the moldy grain and the madness? For the most part, no. The symptoms could appear long after the tainted bread was eaten, making the connection nearly impossible to trace. To a medieval baker, a loaf of bread was either fine or it was possessed by a demon. No one was testing their morning porridge for psychoactive alkaloids. They were far too busy trying not to be excommunicated or eaten by a wolf. Even today, the shadow of this fungus lingers over history. Some scholars have compellingly argued that ergotism may have played a key role in the Salem witch trials of the 1690s. The reported symptoms of the bewitched girls, the fits, the visions, the feeling of being pricked by pins, the paranoia, all align remarkably well with the classic signs of convulsive ergotism. While it remains a debated theory, it is a chilling and thought-provoking possibility. What is not debated, however, is that, for centuries, people all across medieval Europe got high on their toast, and they didn't even know it. It was perhaps the most frightening trip of all, the one you never knew you were taking, and the one from which you might never fully come back. You've heard of flying ointments, and you've heard of bread that could send an entire village into a dancing frenzy. But have you ever heard of mad honey? In a few special corners of the medieval world, it seems that even the bees were in on the secret of intoxication. This wasn't your average sweet honey from the local meadow. We are talking about a rare and potent variety, produced primarily in the mountainous Black Sea regions of what is now modern-day Turkey. The secret to this honey's madness lay in the bee's choice of flower. In this specific region, bees feasted on the nectar of certain rhododendron species. These beautiful, pinkish blooms hold a dark secret. They are naturally laced with compounds called grainotoxins. These are powerful neurotoxins that, to put it mildly, do not play nicely with the human nervous system. When the bees processed this tainted nectar, the toxins became concentrated in the final, sticky, golden product. Consumed in very small doses, mad honey could offer a mild, giddy buzz and a light-headed feeling. In larger doses, however, it could turn your entire day into a slow-motion opera, starring your own eyebrows. The effects included intense dizziness, vomiting, a dangerously slowed heart rate, and powerful hallucinations. Some users reported profound spiritual visions, while others simply reported waking up, clutching a potato they sincerely believed was their long-lost uncle. As with most medieval substances, results tended to vary. This wasn't just a local curiosity. It was occasionally weaponized. Ancient and medieval writers, like the Greek historian Xenophon, recorded stories of invading armies being deliberately poisoned with it. Locals would leave large pots of the toxic honey behind in their abandoned villages as a tempting prize for the soldiers. The invaders, thinking they had found free food, would feast on it, only to end up convulsing on the forest floor, completely incapacitated, and realizing far too late that the local catering was not to be trusted. From the treachery of honey, we turn to something more primal and perhaps more famous in the lore of psychedelia, the magic mushroom. While herbs and roots often required careful grinding, brewing, or mixing into ointments, mushrooms offered a more direct, if equally risky, path to the other world. All one had to do was find the right one in the dark woods, be brave enough to eat it, and then wait for reality to gently unpeel itself. The most iconic of these in medieval Europe was undoubtedly the fly agaric, or Amanita muscaria. Even if you don't know the name, you know the mushroom. It is the toadstool of every fairy tale, a brilliant red or orange cap sprinkled with stark white spots. It looks as though it were designed by a fantasy illustrator, and its otherworldly appearance was a clear sign to medieval people that this was no ordinary fungus. It was seen as a key, a doorway to another plane of existence. Its use is strongly associated with shamanic traditions, particularly in the northernmost parts of Europe and across Siberia, where holy men would consume it to enter a trance state, communicate with spirits, or embark on so-called soul flights. There is also a popular, though heavily debated, theory that it was used by Norse berserkers, who would work themselves into a furious, trance-like rage before battle. While the evidence is thin, the idea that a mushroom could unlock such primal fury has captivated historians for generations. But the fly agaric was also famously toxic. Consuming it improperly could lead to severe vomiting and delirium, not divine insight. The Church, as you can imagine, condemned any such practices as paganism of the highest order. A vision from God was a miracle. A vision from a red and white mushroom was a direct conversation with a demon. These fungi represented a wild, untamable magic that grew in the dark forests, far beyond the control of the cathedral bells and outside the pages of any approved text. Not everyone in the Middle Ages was a priest, a noble, or a peasant toiling in a field. Some people operated in the shadowy, unofficial margins of society. They were known by many names: shamans, herbalists, cunning folk, or wise women. You can think of them as the medieval world's pharmacists, but with absolutely zero regulation and a deep personal relationship with moss and moonlight. These were the people you visited when the university-trained physician, with his limited knowledge and penchant for bleeding, suggested that the best cure for your ailment was to let out a pint of your bad blood. The cunning folk had no fancy degrees from esteemed universities, but they possessed generations of herbal knowledge, often learned by carefully watching their grandmothers treat everything from boils to bad moods with a mixture of bark, leaves, and quiet dignity. And when it came to mind-altering substances, these folk were your trusted guides. They knew exactly which plants to grind into a paste, which roots to soak in wine, and most importantly, they understood the subtle art of dosage. They knew the fine line between a dose that would make you dream of angels and a dose that would make you accidentally try to join them. Whether you were looking to relieve pain, induce a vision, or have a brief out-of-body experience during laundry day, they likely had a remedy for it. A great many of these practitioners were women. Midwives, wise women, and local healers were often the primary healthcare providers for their communities, especially for other women and children. They were essential, yet they were also deeply feared by the male-dominated authority figures of the church and state. It wasn't because they were cackling over cauldrons. It was because their knowledge was powerful. It often worked, and it existed completely outside the control of formal, Latin-speaking institutions. Their remedies were often a fascinating blend of the practical and the magical. They would mix henbane or poppy with wine, fat, or honey. But they might also chant a few protective phrases over the mixture, or instruct you to take it only when the moon was full. This wasn't just superstition. It was part of a holistic worldview where the health of the body and the state of the soul were inextricably linked. Their services could range from a simple sleeping draught to a complex love potion. Of course, if anything went wrong, if a patient's hallucination involved fewer angels and more flying goats, or if a sleeping draught led to a sleep that was a bit too permanent, the blame shifted with terrifying speed. What was once folk medicine could instantly be rebranded as witchcraft. The line between being a respected healer and being accused of consorting with demons was perilously thin, and it was a line these practitioners walked every single day of their lives. And yet, despite the ever-present danger and the suspicion from the authorities, communities absolutely relied on them. When your child had a raging fever in the middle of the night, when your joints ached with a pain that no prayer could soothe, or when you needed a remedy for a sick cow, the cunning folk were the ones you turned to. They filled a vast and critical gap in medieval society's needs. They weren't official doctors, and they certainly weren't priests. They were something else entirely, something existing in the gray space between science and superstition. In a way, you could call them the original underground wellness influencers, operating in a hidden world of whispered secrets, potent herbs, and constant mortal risk. So, after all of these salves and brews, these screaming roots and holy smokes, after the accidental trips on bad bread and the intentional journeys with mad honey, one very big question remains. How did medieval people actually feel about all of this? How did they view the act of getting high? The answer, like so much else in the Middle Ages, is that it was complicated. It was deeply, and sometimes hilariously, conflicted. For some, especially the healers, herbalists, and physicians we've discussed, these mind-altering substances were viewed through a lens of pure pragmatism. They were simply a tool. If a poppy tincture dulled the agony of a battlefield wound, or if a henbane tea slowed a fevered mind and made childbirth 1% less horrifying, it was welcomed as a success. Sure, the patient might start reciting psalms backward, or insisting that the cat was offering financial advice, but if the swelling went down, the treatment was considered a victory. Then there were the spiritual users. For the monks, the mystics, and those who were actively trying to communicate with the divine, hallucinations weren't a red flag, they were a feature. Visions were seen as signs of sanctity, not as symptoms of poisoning. If you fasted for days, prayed for hours, inhaled a lungful of frankincense, and then stared into the void until the void whispered back to you in Latin, you weren't considered intoxicated. You were on the fast track to sainthood, or at the very least, getting your own mural in the local chapel. But for the Church, the crucial element was intent. This is where the official judgment became incredibly nuanced. Getting high by accident from moldy bread was a terrible misfortune. Getting high in a ritual designed to bring you closer to God was potentially acceptable, even holy. But getting high just for the fun of it, or to flirt with what was perceived as a goat demon, now you were deep in the territory of heresy. A vision for a saint was a miracle. A vision for a peasant was probably demonic possession. Meanwhile, among the common folk, opinions were often far more relaxed and practical. The lines were much blurrier. Your neighbor's potent sleeping potion might very well double as their psychedelic nightcap, and no one thought much of it. People used poppy-infused wine for pain and a bit of henbane in their tea to deal with the stress of a bad harvest. It wasn't seen as some grand mystical or rebellious act. It was just part of the medicine chest, stored right next to the dried garlic and the lucky charms. Social status also played a massive role in how an altered state was perceived. A wealthy noblewoman using belladonna to make her eyes look beautiful was seen as fashionable and sophisticated. A poor peasant woman in the woods, using the exact same plant to induce visions, was seen as deeply suspicious and likely a witch. The substance was identical, but the social interpretation of its use could not have been more different. It was a clear case of different rules for different classes. Ultimately, the medieval verdict on getting high came down to three things: who you were, what you were using, and whether or not anyone with power found out about it. In the medieval mind, altered states of consciousness lived in a strange and murky gray area, somewhere between a miracle and a misdemeanor, between a state of health and a state of heresy. It was a world of profound ambiguity. And perhaps that makes sense. In a world where demons and angels were considered active participants in daily life, where plagues could wipe out a third of the population, and where famine was always just one bad harvest away, the idea of a little herbal escape now and then was hardly the most dangerous or unusual thing a person could do. It was just one more risk in a life already full of them. Of all the plants we have discussed, one stands apart for its sheer power and its long, complicated relationship with humanity. It is a flower of beautiful, delicate petals that produces a substance capable of bringing both the most profound relief from pain and the deepest despair of addiction. This is the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, a plant whose legacy was already ancient by the Middle Ages, but which played a quiet, crucial role in the era's understanding of medicine, sleep, and escape. The knowledge of opium was most sophisticated in the great centers of learning in the Islamic world. Celebrated physicians like Avicenna, in his Canon of Medicine, wrote extensively about its uses. They employed it as a powerful anesthetic for surgery, a highly effective cough suppressant, and a remedy for the torments of dysentery. They were well aware of its potency, prescribing it with a level of caution and understanding that was often lacking in a Europe still grappling with more rudimentary herbalism. In Europe, however, opium was still a vital, if less scientifically understood, tool. One of its most famous applications was in the soporific sponge, or spongia somnifera. This was a genuine piece of medieval medical technology. A sea sponge would be soaked in a potent cocktail of opium, mandrake juice, henbane, and other sedatives. It was then dried for storage. When needed for a surgical procedure, the sponge was remoistened and held under the patient's nose, allowing them to inhale the fumes and drift into a state of semi-consciousness. Opium was also the star ingredient in a legendary cure-all known as theriac. This was an elaborate, honey-based paste, a kind of medicinal jam that could contain over 60 different ingredients, including everything from viper's flesh to cinnamon. But its most active and consistently effective ingredient was almost always opium. Theriac was hailed as a universal antidote to poison and a treatment for the plague. Its fame was largely built on the powerful pain-relieving and sedative effects of its primary component. Beyond these complex mixtures, simpler preparations were also common. Opium was often dissolved in wine or other forms of alcohol, creating a potent tincture. This was a direct forerunner to the famous laudanum of later centuries. For the common person, a bottle of this opium-laced wine was the most powerful weapon available against a world of pain. A nagging toothache, a broken bone, or a cough that wouldn't quit could all be silenced by its embrace. While its primary role was medicinal, the line between treatment and recreation was, as always, incredibly fine. In the East, its euphoric properties were sometimes sought after. In Europe, taking a dose for melancholy could easily blur into taking it to simply feel better. The vivid, languid dreams that opium induced could also be interpreted as spiritual journeys, a quiet, personal vision that didn't require the approval of a priest. The dangers, however, were ever present. While the modern clinical model of addiction was centuries away, medieval observers were not entirely blind to the poppy's dark side. Physicians noted that some patients grew dependent on their poppy medicine and suffered greatly if it was withdrawn, and with the imprecise measurements of the time, the difference between a dose that brought sleep and a dose that brought a final, permanent sleep was a constant, terrifying risk. The poppy was the ultimate double-edged sword of the medieval pharmacy. It was, without question, the most effective painkiller the world had to offer, a true gift to anyone suffering in agony. Yet it offered an escape so complete, a serenity so profound, that some who entered its calming embrace found it very difficult to ever leave. It was a quiet but constant presence, offering both salvation and the potential for ruin. While the great and powerful plants like poppy, henbane, and mandrake often steal the historical spotlight, they were far from the only psychoactive options available to the medieval person. The landscape of folk medicine was a dense and tangled forest of countless local remedies and traditions. Many plants had regional fame and were used for generations in specific valleys or villages. Their secrets rarely traveling far beyond the borders of their home. One such plant was wormwood, known to botanists as Artemisia absinthium. This intensely bitter herb was prized primarily as a digestive aid and a potent treatment for intestinal worms, which is where it gets its name. But it also contained a compound called thujan, which could have mild mind-altering effects in sufficient doses, long before it became famous as the key ingredient in the absinthe of 19th-century Paris. Wormwood was used to flavor bitter ales and tonics, adding an extra kick that was more than just the alcohol. Another curious case was that of darnel, a weed known biblically as tears, which often grew alongside wheat. To a farmer, it was mostly a nuisance that contaminated the harvest. But darnel seeds were often infected with a fungus that produced alkaloids. When this contaminated grain was accidentally milled into flour and baked into bread, it could cause an illness known as darnel poisoning. The symptoms were a powerful sense of drunkenness, trembling, dizziness, and impaired vision. It was yet another accidental trip delivered by the daily bread. Sometimes the journey was not into the mind, but straight into mortal peril due to mistaken identity. Water hemlock, one of Europe's most violently toxic plants, has a root that looks deceptively similar to a wild parsnip or carrot. Foragers could easily make a fatal mistake. The result wasn't a gentle high, but a swift and horrific poisoning, characterized by seizures so violent they were often the cause of death. It's a grim reminder that for every useful herb there was a deadly look-alike, and expertise was the only thing standing between a meal and the grave. Not all of these lesser-known plants were so dramatic. Consider wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa. Its stems produce a milky white sap known as lacticarium, which earned it the rather grand nickname of lettuce opium. In reality, its effects were far milder. It acted as a gentle sedative and painkiller, more akin to a modern valerian root supplement than a powerful narcotic. It was likely used for restlessness, anxiety, or mild aches, proving that medieval herbalism had its subtle tools as well as its sledgehammers. We must also remember the immense power of ritual and belief. For many of these folk remedies, the psychological setting was just as important as the chemical compounds. A potion prepared with great ceremony, with chants whispered over it by a respected healer, and instructions to drink it at a specific, magical time, would feel infinitely more potent. The user's expectation and the healer's authority could amplify the effects of even a mildly active substance, turning a simple sedative into a profound experience. The reason many of these traditions remain obscure is because they were often secret. This knowledge was not recorded in the great medical universities. It was passed down orally, from mother to daughter, from master to apprentice. This made it vulnerable. Much of this ancient wisdom was lost to time, or was deliberately and violently suppressed during the great witch hunts, when possessing such knowledge was not a sign of wisdom, but evidence of a pact with the devil. The medieval world of intoxication, then, was far richer and more varied than a handful of famous herbs. Every forest and every field held its own secrets, its own potential cures, and its own hidden dangers. It was a world where the line between food, medicine, and poison had to be drawn anew every single day, often by trial and, all too often, by tragic error. For most of our journey, we have walked through gardens and forests, exploring the power that grew naturally from the earth. But now, we turn from the world of plants to the world of process. We enter the smoky, secretive workshop of the alchemist to discuss a technology that would forever change the nature of intoxication, distillation. This knowledge, which slowly trickled into Europe from the great intellectual centers of the Islamic world, was a true game-changer. The first and most important product of the alchemists still was a clear, fiery liquid known by the enchanting name aqua vita, a Latin phrase meaning the water of life. Initially, this was not seen as a social beverage for taverns. It was considered a powerful medicine, a pure essence extracted from wine, believed to be the very spirit of the grape made manifest. This potent liquid was thought to preserve health, restore youth, and cure a host of diseases. This was the domain of the alchemist. While we often remember them today for their quest to turn lead into gold, a huge part of their work revolved around perfecting the art of distillation. They weren't just mystical gold bugs. They were the experimental chemists of their day. Using their glass alembics and gentle fires, they sought to separate the subtle from the gross, to isolate the very soul or spirit of a substance, be it wine, herbs, or even minerals. In practice, this led to the creation of the first fortified wines and herbal liqueurs. By adding aqua vita to wine, it could be preserved for longer voyages and given a powerful kick. By steeping herbs and spices in the potent spirit, alchemists and, most famously, monks created powerful medicinal cordials. The secret recipes for liqueurs like chartreuse and benedictine have their origins in this very medieval tradition of creating potent, spirit-based elixirs for health and vitality. Slowly but surely, the use of the water of life began to shift from the purely medicinal to the recreational. As the technology of distillation became more widespread and less the exclusive property of monasteries and alchemical workshops, the production of distilled spirits increased. People began to appreciate this potent new drink not just for its supposed health benefits, but for its swift and powerful intoxicating effect. This was the birth of hard liquor in Europe, a profound change from the gentle buzz of beer and wine. But the alchemists still chased a grander prize, the elixir of life. This was the ultimate potion, a mythical substance said to grant the drinker immortality, or, at the very least, perfect health and eternal youth. In their relentless pursuit of this fantasy, they distilled nearly everything they could get their hands on, from rare herbs to precious gems. While they never found the secret to eternal life, their endless experimentation laid the groundwork for modern chemistry and pharmacology. This new technology was not without its significant dangers. Early distillation methods were crude, and temperature control was difficult. This meant that early spirits could be contaminated with toxic byproducts like methanol, which could cause blindness or even death. Furthermore, the sheer alcoholic strength of aqua vita was a shock to bodies that were accustomed to the relative mildness of ale. The water of life could very easily and very quickly become the water of death if handled without extreme care. Distillation, then, introduced a new kind of intoxicating power to the medieval world. It was a power that was concentrated, refined, and man-made, offering a more predictable, if far more intense, experience than most raw herbs. It marked a fundamental shift from simply using what nature provided to actively transforming nature's gifts into something else entirely, setting the stage for the future of both science and spirits. For every quiet herbalist gathering plants by moonlight, and for every alchemist carefully tending his still, there existed a powerful and opposing force, a force of control, condemnation, and deep suspicion. The world of medieval intoxication was not a free-for-all. Both the towering authority of the Church and the growing power of secular rulers had very strong opinions about altered states, especially when they threatened to unravel the tight fabric of social order and religious dogma. The Church's primary theological objection was centered on the concept of reason. In medieval Christian thought, the ability to reason was a divine gift from God, the very faculty that separated humanity from the beasts of the field. It was through reason that one could choose good over evil. Any substance that clouded the mind, suppressed reason, and led to a loss of self-control was therefore seen as spiritually dangerous. It was a willful surrender to base animalistic impulses and an open invitation for demonic forces to enter the unguarded soul. Furthermore, the Church was engaged in a long and arduous campaign to stamp out the last vestiges of pre-Christian or pagan traditions. Many of the folk practices involving psychoactive plants were direct remnants of these older belief systems. Using a particular mushroom to induce a trance or a specific root for divination wasn't just getting high in the eyes of a priest. It was actively participating in a rival and therefore diabolical spiritual framework. It was heresy in herbal form. Secular rulers, the kings, lords, and city councils, had more worldly concerns. Their main priority was maintaining social order. Widespread drunkenness led to street brawls, theft, and a general neglect of one's duties to lord and family. Taverns and alehouses, while important social hubs, were also viewed as potential hotbeds of gossip, immoral behavior, and even seditious plotting. As cities grew, we begin to see the first attempts at regulation, laws setting curfews for alehouses and punishments like the stocks for public drunkenness. This raises a key question. Why was alcohol generally tolerated, while herbal intoxicants were so often condemned? The answer lies in integration and economics. Alcohol, in the form of beer and wine, was deeply woven into the medieval economy. It was safer than water, a vital source of calories for the working poor, and a commodity that could be taxed. It was even central to the most sacred Christian rite, the Eucharist. Herbal highs, in contrast, were unpredictable, produced no tax revenue, and were associated with a magical fringe that authorities were keen to suppress. Even the official medical establishment played a role in this condemnation. University-trained physicians, who practiced a formal medicine based on the ancient Greek texts of Galen, often looked down upon the village wise woman or the wandering herbalist. They saw these folk healers as ignorant charlatans and dangerous competitors. By dismissing their herbal remedies as superstitious nonsense or witchcraft, they were also performing a kind of professional gatekeeping, cementing their own status as the only legitimate practitioners of medicine. The most extreme form of this condemnation came, of course, from the Inquisition. For an inquisitor investigating a charge of witchcraft, the testimony of a person claiming to have flown on a broomstick was not interpreted as a drug-induced hallucination. It was taken as a literal confession of fact, proof of a pact with Satan and attendance at a demonic Sabbath. The psychoactive properties of the plants were unwittingly providing evidence for a vast diabolical conspiracy that, in the minds of the inquisitors, had to be eradicated with fire and faith. And yet, despite all this powerful condemnation from pulpits and thrones, the use of these substances never truly disappeared. The official laws and doctrines were one thing. What ordinary people did in the privacy of their homes or the secrecy of the deep woods was another. the profound human desire for relief from pain, for a glimpse of the divine, or simply for a momentary escape from a brutal reality, was a force that sermons and statutes could never fully extinguish. Let us now journey north into the cold fjords and misty halls of the Norsemen. When we think of the Vikings, we often picture fierce warriors and bold explorers, their culture defined by the axe and the longship. But there was another side to their world, one of deep mysticism and powerful, ecstatic experiences. So, beyond the celebratory horns of mead, what role did altered states of consciousness play in the Viking Age? We must begin with the most legendary and terrifying figure of all, the berserker. The Norse sagas describe these elite warriors as men who would enter a battle in a trance-like fury, a state known as berserkergang. They were said to howl like wild animals, bite the iron rims of their shields, and fight with a strength that was more than human, seemingly immune to pain or fear. The name itself may mean bear shirt, perhaps suggesting they fought without armor, clad only in animal rage. For centuries, historians and enthusiasts have debated the source of this incredible fury. The most famous and enduring theory suggests that the berserkers consumed the psychoactive fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, before a battle. The known effects of the mushroom, agitation, delirium, muscle spasms, and a distorted sense of reality, seem to line up eerily well with the saga descriptions of the berserker's rage. It's a compelling image, a warrior fueling his battle frenzy with the magic of the fairy tale toadstool. However, it is crucial to state that this mushroom theory is heavily debated and far from proven. Other historians propose more mundane, yet equally plausible, explanations. The rage could have been induced by consuming vast quantities of strong ale, by a form of self-hypnosis achieved through ritualistic chanting and dancing before a fight. Or it could have even been a specific psychological condition, a kind of battle-induced hysteria passed down through warrior lodges. The true source of the berserker's power remains a tantalizing mystery. But the warrior was not the only one in Norse society who sought to alter their consciousness. Let us turn from the battlefield to the high seat of the Valva, the Cirrus. The Valva was one of the most respected and feared figures in the Viking world. She was a powerful prophetess and shaman who could see the future, communicate with the spirits of the dead, and advise chieftains and kings on the will of the gods. To perform her magic, the Valva had to enter a deep trance state. The sagas describe elaborate rituals where she would sit on a special platform, holding a ceremonial staff, while other women chanted a specific song called a varloker to help her on her spiritual journey. It is highly likely that psychoactive plants played a role in this process. While the sagas are often vague on the details, the use of herbs, like henbane, which was known in Scandinavia, or other local sedatives and hallucinogens, to help open the mind to visions, fits perfectly within the broader European folk magic traditions. And we cannot forget the role of alcohol in ritual. For the Vikings, strong ale and sweet mead were not just drinks for a party, they were sacred beverages. Drinking was a central part of religious feasts, or sharing a horn of consecrated ale was a way to forge bonds within the community and to commune directly with the gods. The intoxication itself could be seen as a form of divine inspiration, a way of lowering the barrier between the mortal world of Midgard and the divine realm of Asgard. The Norse world, then, was one that embraced ecstatic experience, whether it was the terrifying fury of the warrior or the profound wisdom of the seer. For the Vikings, pushing the boundaries of normal consciousness was not necessarily a weakness or a sin. It was a path to power. It was a way to touch the primal forces of the gods and of their own inner nature, leading them either to glory in this world or to a glimpse of the next. We have explored the plants, the potions, and the people who used them. But this raises another, more subtle question. Can we see the influence of these altered states in the art and stories that the Middle Ages left behind? This is, of course, a difficult question to answer. Medieval artists and writers rarely left diaries detailing their chemical muses. But by looking closely at the strange and surreal creations of the era, we can find some intriguing hints and tantalizing possibilities. Consider the bizarre world of manuscript marginalia. In the borders of beautiful, sacred texts, scribes and illustrators would often draw strange, surreal little figures known as grotesques. You might find a knight locked in mortal combat with a giant snail, a rabbit playing a trumpet, or a hybrid monster with the head of a bishop and the body of a fish. While many were simply jokes or symbolic allegories, the sheer, unbridled weirdness of some of these images feels like it comes from a dream, or perhaps a vision inspired by a mild dose of ergot or a strange brew. No discussion of this topic would be complete without mentioning the master of the medieval macabre, Hieronymus Bosch. His epic paintings, like the Garden of Earthly Delights, are populated with some of the most fantastical and nightmarish imagery ever put to panel. His landscapes teem with surreal creatures, impossible architecture, and scenes of both heavenly ecstasy and hellish torment. For centuries, art historians have debated the source of his unique vision. While many attribute it to his deep religious piety and an intense fear of sin, it is hard not to wonder if his imagination was in some way informed by the hallucinatory potential of the plants we've discussed. Let's turn from art to literature, specifically the writings of the great medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen. She was a nun, an abbess, a composer, and a respected expert in herbal medicine. She also recorded intensely vivid and deeply strange divine visions, which she attributed directly to God. Modern scholars, while respecting her faith, have noted that some of her descriptions, flashing lights, shimmering patterns, a feeling of leaving the body, are similar to those produced by certain altered states. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs may have inadvertently played a role in creating the physiological conditions for these profound spiritual experiences. We can even see echoes in the great courtly romances. Think of the quest for the Holy Grail. It is a search not just for a physical object, but for a moment of divine, ecstatic union. The knights who seek it, like Galahad and Percival, wander through enchanted forests and have powerful, dreamlike visions that test their faith and purity. These literary quests for a transcendent state could be seen as an allegory for the kind of inner journeys that were sometimes pursued through deep prayer, fasting, and perhaps with the aid of a carefully prepared herbal potion. And then there is Dante's Inferno. The sheer, detailed creativity of the punishments, the bizarre demons, and the surreal landscapes of hell represent a monumental feat of the imagination. While this is undoubtedly a work of theological and poetic genius, the cultural reservoir from which Dante drew his inspiration would have included an awareness of altered states, the burning sensations of St. Anthony's fire, the delirium of henbane, the tormenting visions of a bad trip. These real-world experiences may have provided a grim palette for painting his picture of eternal damnation. The great challenge, of course, is that we can never truly know. It's a chicken or the egg problem. Did these substances directly inspire the art? Or did the existing religious and folk beliefs provide a ready-made framework for people to interpret their hallucinations? The answer is almost certainly a complex dance between the two. A person's vision, whether from a mushroom or a miracle, was always shaped by the language and images of their culture. So while we lack a signed confession from any artist or poet, it is fascinating to think that the strange and beautiful artifacts of the medieval world might contain the faint, dreamlike echoes of these potent plants. The visions, whether they came from God, from guilt, or from a garden, found their way into the ink and the paint, leaving behind a mysterious legacy that continues to captivate and puzzle us to this day. The world we have been exploring, a world of screaming roots, flying ointments, and divinely inspired visions, was a complex and deeply ingrained part of medieval life. But it could not last forever. As the Middle Ages waned and the first light of a new era began to dawn, a series of profound changes would sweep across Europe, forever altering humanity's relationship with the substances that grew in its gardens and forests. One of the first great agents of this change was a machine, the printing press. Before its invention in the mid-15th century, knowledge was precious, localized, and often passed down by word of mouth. But printing allowed for the mass production and standardization of information. Medical texts and detailed herbals, once the property of rich monasteries, could now be distributed widely. This created a more uniform, official body of knowledge that began to marginalize the varied oral traditions of local folk healers. This era also gave rise to revolutionary thinkers like Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist, who represented a bridge between the old world and the new. He rejected the ancient dogmas and argued that the power of a plant lay not in its magical shape or spirit, but in its specific chemical essence. He championed the idea of isolating a plant's active ingredient to create pure and potent drugs. His famous declaration, "The dose makes the poison," was a clarion call for a new, more scientific pharmacology. At the same time, the Protestant Reformation was tearing the religious world apart. The new Protestant faiths, with their intense focus on Scripture and their deep suspicion of anything that smelled of Catholic ritual or pagan holdovers, launched a vigorous new war on what they defined as superstition. Many of the folk traditions involving herbal magic, which the medieval church had sometimes tolerated, were now aggressively condemned as demonic, driving such practices even further underground. These intellectual and religious shifts helped fuel the tragic and brutal peak of the great European witch hunts in the 16th and 17th centuries. In this climate of fear and paranoia, the old knowledge became a terrible liability. The ability to prepare a sleeping draught from henbane or a pain-relieving salve from poppy was no longer seen as a healing skill. It was twisted into irrefutable evidence of a pact with Satan. The flying ointment of folklore became a signed confession in a capital trial. And as Europe looked inward with suspicion, it was also looking outward with ambition. The age of exploration brought a flood of new substances back to the continent that would completely reshape its habits. The arrival of coffee from the Ottoman Empire, tea from Asia, and tobacco and chocolate from the Americas introduced a new kind of intoxication, one based on stimulation, sociability, and global commerce. The quiet, strange visions of the medieval garden began to be replaced by the caffeinated buzz of the new coffee houses. Together, these forces, the rise of science, the turmoil of religious reform, the terror of the witch hunts, and the arrival of new global drugs, spelled the end of an era. The enchanted, holistic worldview, where a root could scream and a fungus could be a doorway to heaven, began to fade. It was replaced by a more mechanistic, chemical understanding of the world. The village wise woman was slowly being replaced by the university chemist. But this ancient knowledge did not vanish entirely. It was submerged. It survived in the quiet corners of rural folk medicine, in the cryptic pages of alchemical texts, and in the enduring human fascination with the hidden powers of the natural world. The uniquely medieval relationship with these plants was coming to a close, but their long, strange story was far from over. They were simply waiting to be rediscovered by a new age in a new context. As the great wooden ships of Europe dropped anchor off the coasts of a world they never knew existed, their crews were not just searching for gold, spices, or a new route to India. They were, without realizing it, about to witness a completely different universe of intoxication. They stumbled into ancient civilizations that possessed a deep, powerful, and highly sophisticated relationship with psychoactive plants, setting the stage for a profound collision of consciousness. The first and most widespread of these sacred plants to make its way back to Europe was tobacco. To the indigenous peoples of the Americas, tobacco was far more than a simple recreational smoke. It was a spirit, a powerful medicine, and a sacred tool for diplomacy and ritual. It was smoked, drunk as a tea, and used in ceremonies to seal treaties and communicate with the divine. The potent, unfiltered tobacco of that time could be intensely intoxicating, capable of inducing lightheadedness and even trance-like states. Further south, in the arid lands of what is now Mexico and the American Southwest, Spanish explorers encountered the powerful psychedelic cacti. The small, unassuming peyote cactus, containing the potent hallucinogen mescaline, was a central part of religious life for many native peoples. Consumed in highly structured, all-night ceremonies, it was a sacrament used for healing, for divination, and for seeking guidance from the spirit world. This was not a party. It was a pilgrimage of the mind. The Spanish also found a rich tradition of mushroom use in Mesoamerica. The Aztec and their neighbors revered certain species of psilocybin mushrooms, which they called a Nahuatl name that beautifully translates to flesh of the gods. These were not foraged for food. They were eaten often at night in quiet, ceremonial settings by priests and nobles to induce powerful visions, to predict the future of a battle, or to communicate directly with their pantheon of deities. The reaction of the Spanish conquistadors and the Catholic missionaries who followed them was one of absolute horror. With no framework for understanding these practices beyond their own rigid dogma, they saw only devilry. To them, these sacred plants were not conduits to any true god, but were instruments of Satan, used to delude the natives and lead them to damnation. They brutally suppressed these indigenous religions, burning sacred books and punishing anyone found practicing the old ways. The flesh of the gods was swiftly rebranded as the flesh of the devil. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, indigenous peoples had developed a form of pharmacology so complex it baffles modern science to this day. They learned to combine two completely different plants to create the powerful visionary brew known as ayahuasca. One plant provided the psychoactive compound, while the second plant contained a substance that allowed the first to become active when consumed orally. This level of sophisticated, synergistic chemistry was something European alchemists could only dream of achieving. And high in the Andes, the coca leaf was the lifeblood of the Inca Empire. It was not the illicit party drug it would later become. It was a sacred leaf, chewed by everyone from messengers running on mountain trails to farmers tilling fields at high altitude. It provided energy, dulled hunger and pain, and served as a sacred offering to the Pasha Mama, or Mother Earth. It was a vital part of daily life, medicine, and religion, woven into the very fabric of Andean society. This encounter was a true clash of worlds. The Europeans, with their own history of henbane, mandrake, and alcohol, were nonetheless unprepared for the sheer power and deep spiritual integration of the plant medicines they found in the Americas. Their reaction to condemn, to misinterpret, and to brutally suppress would have dramatic and tragic consequences, forcing these ancient traditions into the shadows, where many would have to fight for centuries simply to survive. As we leave the early modern period behind and drift into the 18th and 19th centuries, the world of intoxication transforms once again. The Industrial Revolution is chugging to life. Cities are swelling, and the scientific mindset of the Enlightenment is taking hold. The old village herbalist, with her garden of secrets, has been largely replaced by the pharmacist in his clean, cord-organized shop, complete with polished brass scales and rows of glass bottles. The relationship with these substances is becoming less magical, more scientific, and far, far more commercial. The great scientific leap forward of this era was the isolation of alkaloids, the pure, active chemical compounds from the plants that had been used for millennia. In 1804, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Sertiner finally managed to isolate morphine from raw opium. It was a watershed moment. This was soon followed by the isolation of cocaine from coca leaves, atropine from belladonna, and many others. This was the alchemist's dream made real, pure, potent, and most importantly, perfectly measurable drugs. This new chemical power was amplified by a new technology, the hypodermic needle, which was perfected in the 1850s for the first time. These pure alkaloids could be injected directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the digestive system entirely. This made their effects incredibly fast and powerful, but it also dramatically increased their addictive potential. During the American Civil War, morphine injections were used widely to treat the agony of battlefield injuries, leading to the first major epidemic of morphine addiction, tragically known as the soldier's disease. For the public at large, this was the golden age of patent medicines. These were commercially produced, heavily advertised elixirs and pills that made extraordinary claims, promising to cure everything from coughs and consumption to baldness and female weakness. These concoctions were completely unregulated, and their secret formulas often contained shocking amounts of opium, morphine, alcohol, and even cannabis or cocaine. A mother trying to quiet a fussy baby might reach for a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was little more than morphine dissolved in alcohol. A person feeling tired or suffering from nervousness might take a swig of a popular tonic like Vin Mariani, a French wine that had been infused with coca leaves, giving it a healthy dose of cocaine. It was wildly popular, endorsed by queens, inventors, and even to different popes. The chemical innovations continued at a breathless pace. In 1897, the Bayer Company in Germany synthesized a new derivative of morphine that they claimed was more effective and, they hoped, non-addictive. They marketed it as a cough suppressant and painkiller under the brand name heroin. Around the same time, cocaine was being hailed as a miracle drug, used by doctors as an anesthetic, and famously included as an ingredient in the original formulation of Coca-Cola. The result of this unregulated free-for-all was a quiet, creeping pandemic of addiction. While the medieval high was often a rare, ritualistic, or accidental event, the 19th century introduced the phenomenon of quiet, daily dependence. Housewives across Europe and America prescribed laudanum or cocaine-laced tonics for their nerves, found themselves trapped in a cycle of addiction they could neither understand nor escape. This dangerous era of blissful ignorance eventually reached a breaking point. The growing public awareness of widespread addiction, coupled with numerous deaths from overdoses and contaminated products, led to a powerful public outcry. This outcry would pave the way for the first major drug control laws of the early 20th century. Like the Pure Food and Drug Act in America, the pendulum was about to swing hard in the other direction, from a world of total freedom to a new world of strict prohibition. The 19th century ended with a world awash in powerful, unregulated drugs. The 20th century would be defined by the dramatic reaction. The pendulum, having swung to the extreme of commercial freedom, was about to swing back with incredible force. This was the dawn of a new era, the age of global prohibition, where the government, not the gardener or the pharmacist, would decide what a person was allowed to consume. Starting in the early 1900s, nations around the world began passing sweeping legislation to control these substances. Laws like the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the United States effectively criminalized opiates and cocaine. Heroin, once sold over the counter by Bayer as a supposedly safe cough suppressant, became public enemy number one. The reasoning behind these laws was a complex mixture of genuine public health concern, intense moral panic, and a desire for social control. The plants that were once medicine and the chemicals that were once marvels were now rebranded as dangerous, illicit narcotics. Of course, making these substances illegal did not make them disappear. It simply pushed them from the pharmacy and the open market into the shadows. This created a new underground world of smugglers, dealers, and clandestine users. The person seeking relief or escape was no longer a patient being prescribed a tonic, but a criminal risking prison. The romance and mystery of the alchemist's workshop was replaced by the grit and danger of the black market. But even as the world was trying to lock these substances away, science was inadvertently finding the keys. In 1943, a Swiss chemist at Sandoz Laboratories named Albert Hofmann was re-examining a compound he had first created 5 years earlier from the ergot fungus, the very same fungus that caused St. Anthony's fire when he accidentally absorbed a minuscule amount. He began to feel dizzy and saw an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. His now famous bicycle ride home that day was the world's first intentional LSD trip. Just over a decade later, another rediscovery occurred. An American banker and amateur mycologist named R. Gordon Wasson traveled to a remote village in Mexico. There, he was allowed to participate in a sacred mushroom ceremony led by a Mazatec shaman. His powerful account of this experience, published in a 1957 issue of Life magazine, introduced the concept of psilocybin magic mushrooms to the Western mainstream for the very first time. The ancient, the flesh of the gods, had been found again. These two events, the synthesis of LSD and the rediscovery of psilocybin, collided with the social turmoil of the 1960s to create the psychedelic counterculture, a new generation seeking spiritual enlightenment and a rejection of social conformity embraced these substances. The medieval mystic's vision was reborn as the hippies' trip. Figures like Timothy Leary urged young people to use these tools to explore the inner workings of their own minds, just as shamans had done for thousands of years. The backlash from the establishment was swift and severe. Alarmed by the widespread recreational use and fueled by media stories of bad trips and psychotic breaks, governments around the world moved to outlaw these newly rediscovered substances. LSD and psilocybin were placed in the most restrictive legal categories, and nearly all promising scientific and psychiatric research into their potential therapeutic benefits was shut down for almost half a century. And so, the story came full circle. The 20th century, which began with an attempt to completely control and prohibit these ancient tools, also became the century of their scientific rediscovery. The plants and fungi of the medieval garden and the Mesoamerican jungle had not truly vanished. They had been waiting quietly in the shadows of folklore and in the footnotes of obscure academic papers, ready to re-emerge and challenge the modern world's understanding of consciousness all over again. After the counterculture of the 1960s burned out, a long, cold winter descended upon psychedelic research. For nearly half a century, these fascinating and powerful compounds were largely demonized, their study relegated to the fringes. But in the quiet halls of science in the 21st century, a thaw has begun. A new generation of researchers is carefully and rigorously re-examining these ancient substances, not as dangerous party drugs, but as potentially transformative therapeutic tools. Leading universities like Johns Hopkins, Imperial College London, and NYU are now conducting groundbreaking studies with psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms. They are investigating its potential to treat some of the most stubborn mental health conditions of our time: severe depression, crippling anxiety in terminally ill patients, and persistent addiction. The results have been so promising that they are challenging decades of dogma about the nature of these drugs. In a way, this is a return to a very old idea. A medieval physician might have prescribed an opium-laced wine for a case of profound melancholy. Today, a clinical psychiatrist might guide a patient through a psilocybin session to treat deep-rooted depression. The language has shifted from the spiritual to the clinical, from humors to neurotransmitters. But the fundamental goal is the same: to use a powerful substance to heal the mind and alleviate deep psychic suffering. We can even see echoes of old folk practices in modern trends like microdosing. This involves taking a tiny, subperceptual dose of a substance like LSD or psilocybin, not to have a visionary experience, but to subtly enhance mood, creativity, and focus. This is, in essence, a high-tech version of the medieval herbalist's tincture. A small daily dose, taken for vitality or to sharpen the senses, adapted for the pressures of the modern world. The search for spiritual experience has also gone global. Ayahuasca, once a brew prepared only by shamans deep in the Amazon rainforest, is now known around the world. Westerners now travel to South America in search of healing and spiritual insight, participating in ceremonies led by modern shamans. They are seeking the same thing the medieval mystics and Norse seers sought: a direct, transformative experience of the sacred, guided by a plant teacher. And of course, there is the dramatic comeback of cannabis. Once demonized, it is now being legalized for both medical and recreational use across the globe. Its modern medical uses for chronic pain, nausea from chemotherapy, and anxiety mirror its historical uses as a medicine in the Islamic Golden Age and in ancient Chinese texts. The Sultan's Secret is now available at a government-licensed dispensary. Modern psychedelic therapy places a huge emphasis on the concepts of set and setting, the mindset of the user, and the environment of the experience. Therapists now recognize that these factors are crucial for a positive outcome. This is something the ancients knew instinctively. The fasting, the ceremonial chants, the sacred space of the temple or the forest grove, the guidance of a trusted priest or shaman, these were all sophisticated ways of controlling set and setting to ensure the journey was a healing one. And so, our long, strange trip comes full circle. After centuries of fear, suppression, and profound misunderstanding, we are, perhaps, beginning to relearn some of the wisdom of the past. We are discovering that these substances are not inherently good or evil. They are simply powerful tools. And like any tool, their effect, whether it is healing or harmful, sacred or profane, depends entirely on the knowledge, the intention, and the respect with which they are wielded. The medieval world understood this in its own way, and it is a lesson we are only now, carefully, beginning to appreciate again. Let us take a step back from the grand sweep of history and focus, for a moment, on a single room. Let us imagine ourselves stepping out of the muddy medieval street and into the quiet, dim world of an apothecary's shop. The air inside is thick with 1,000 competing scents, the dry, dusty smell of dried lavender and chamomile, the sharp tang of resinous frankincense, the earthy aroma of dug-up roots, and the faint, sweet promise of honey. This was not merely a shop. It was a laboratory, a library of natural knowledge, and a sanctuary from the pains of the outside world. The tools of this trade were simple, yet elegant and essential. A heavy stone mortar and pestle sat on a sturdy wooden bench, used for grinding seeds, leaves, and minerals into fine powders. Beside it, a set of delicate brass balance scales with tiny, carefully guarded weights for measuring out precious and dangerous ingredients. The shelves would be lined with ceramic jars, often beautifully decorated, called albarelli, each containing a different dried herb. And in a corner, perhaps a small furnace and a collection of glass vials and alembics for the slow, careful work of distillation. Acquiring these ingredients was an art in itself. The apothecary could not simply order a shipment of henbane. They, or the herbalists who supplied them, had to know the land intimately. They understood that the potency of a plant depended on the season it was gathered, the soil it grew in, and even the time of day. Folk tradition, passed down through generations, often dictated that certain magical herbs must be gathered only at midnight or during a specific phase of the moon, a practice that imbued the plant with a sense of ritual power before it was ever even used. Much of their work was guided by a beautiful, if unscientific, philosophy known as the doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that God, in His wisdom, had placed a sign or a signature on every plant to indicate its purpose for humanity. A plant with a heart-shaped leaf, for example, must be good for the heart. The spotted leaves of lungwort resembled diseased lungs, so it was used for respiratory ailments. And of course, the uncanny human-like shape of the mandrake root was the most powerful signature of all, marking it as a plant with power over the whole human body. This was often combined with the dominant medical theory of the age, Herbalism, the idea inherited from the ancient Greeks, was that the body was composed of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was simply an imbalance of these humors. Every herb and food was classified by its properties: hot, cold, moist, or dry, and was prescribed to counteract an imbalance. A fever, being a hot and dry condition, might be treated with a cold and moist herb like cucumber or violet. The apothecary was also a master of the compound. A single herb was rarely considered sufficient for a serious ailment. Instead, they practiced a complex form of polypharmacy, mixing dozens of ingredients into a single remedy, like the famous theriac. The belief was that the various ingredients could support and enhance one another's properties, creating a synergistic effect that was greater than the sum of its parts. Crafting such a recipe was a true art, requiring immense knowledge and experience. We should also take a moment to appreciate the immense weight of responsibility that rested on these individuals. With potent and unpredictable substances, and without the aid of modern diagnostics, every decision was a gamble. A few grains too many of a powdered root could be the difference between a peaceful sleep and a permanent one. An error in identifying a plant could lead to a horrific poisoning. The apothecary walked a tightrope every day, with the health and lives of their community balanced precariously in their hands. The medieval apothecary, then, was so much more than a simple merchant. They were a botanist, a chemist, a philosopher, and a psychologist, all in one. Their shop was the crucial intersection where the physical properties of plants met the spiritual beliefs of the people. It was a place where science and magic were not yet enemies, but were still working hand in hand, trying to bring a little bit of order and relief to a chaotic and often painful world. So far in our journey, we've seen how medieval people used plants to heal their bodies, quiet their minds, and seek visions of the divine. But there was another, equally powerful motivation that drove them to the apothecary and the herbalist: the timeless and often turbulent affairs of the human heart. Let us now delve into the whispered world of love potions, aphrodisiacs, and their dark and dangerous cousin, poison. The desire to magically compel love is a theme as old as time, and the Middle Ages was no exception. Love potions were a staple of folk magic, often containing ingredients that worked on the principle of sympathy. A lock of hair, a drop of blood, or a red ribbon might be included to bind two people together. But potent herbs were also key ingredients. A small, carefully measured amount of mandrake or henbane might be added, not to magically create affection, but perhaps to lower a person's inhibitions, confuse their senses, or make them more open to suggestion. Distinct from the coercive magic of a love potion was the more medicinal pursuit of the aphrodisiac. These were herbs and foods believed to stimulate desire and improve performance. Many of these followed the doctrine of signatures. Plants, like orchids, with their testicle-shaped roots, were considered potent in this regard. Others were based on humoral theory. Hot and moist foods, like ginger, cloves, pepper, and rich spiced wine, were thought to inflame the passions, and were staples of any romantic feast. It's crucial to remember the immense power of psychology in these matters. If a person was secretly given a love potion and then treated with affection, they might attribute their burgeoning feelings to the magic brew. The belief in the potion's power could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The same is true for aphrodisiacs. A man who ate a dish seasoned with expensive, hot spices would likely feel more amorous, not just from any chemical effect, but because he fully expected to. The potion was often just a catalyst for the mind. Interestingly, the same principles were applied in reverse. For those seeking to quench the flames of passion, there were aphrodisiacs, monks, nuns, and priests, struggling to maintain their vows of chastity, would sometimes consume herbs, considered cold and dry in humoral theory. Plants like water lily, camphor, and rue were believed to cool the blood and suppress worldly desires, helping the devout to keep their minds focused on God rather than earthly matters. But the line between a potion for love and one for hate could be perilously thin. The same herbal knowledge that could supposedly create desire could just as easily be used for a much darker purpose. The cunning folk who might be sought out for a love charm could, with a different request, provide a powder to cause illness, madness, or worse. The difference between a dose meant to confuse and a dose meant to kill was often just a matter of a few extra grains. Poisoning was a real and present fear in the medieval world, especially among the political elite where power was contested. An inconvenient rival, an unfaithful spouse, or a troublesome heir could be quietly and effectively removed with a substance slipped into their wine. The classic poisons of choice were often the very same plants from the healer's garden: the deadly nightshade, belladonna, the potent monkshood, also known as wolfsbane, or the seeds of the hemlock plant. This was the dark and deadly application of the apothecary's art. Ultimately, this dive into the world of potions and poisons reveals the raw human core of our story. It shows that these powerful plants were not just tools for interacting with the divine or treating a fever. They were instruments in the messy, passionate, and sometimes dangerous dramas between people. In a world where most individuals had very little control over their own destiny, a potion that promised to win a heart or remove an enemy was a tempting, if terrifying, way to try and seize control of fate itself. Throughout our exploration, our focus has remained squarely on humanity. The healers, mystics, and ordinary folk who sought to alter their own consciousness. But let us now broaden our gaze and ask a curious question. Were humans the only ones? The medieval world was teeming with animal life, and the same potent plants were available to them as well. While we can never truly know an animal's subjective experience, historical observations and folklore suggest that intoxication was not a uniquely human pursuit. The most common and observable examples were simple and seasonal. Anyone living in the countryside would have seen birds in late autumn feasting on berries that had begun to ferment on the vine. They would watch as the birds became clumsy, disoriented, and unable to fly straight, in short, drunk. Similarly, they would have noticed bees becoming sluggish and dizzy after visiting the nectar of certain flowers. This was seen as a simple, often comical, quirk of nature's great pageant. Then there is the timeless and delightful mystery of cats and catnip. The herb, known as Nepeta cataria, was a common feature in medieval gardens, often grown by people for its use as a mild, calming tea. But its extraordinary effect on their feline companions would have been a source of constant fascination. To watch a stoic mouser suddenly roll around in ecstatic bliss, purring and chasing imaginary foes after a sniff of this one particular plant, must have been a charming reminder that the world held strange and specific chemical keys for different creatures. A more profound example of this interspecies connection may come from the fly agaric mushroom. Some ethnomycologists theorize that ancient peoples of northern Europe and Siberia first learned of the mushroom's powers by observing local wildlife, Reindeer, in particular, have been known to seek out and eat these mushrooms, after which they behave erratically, running in circles and seeming agitated. It is plausible that an ancient hunter or shaman, witnessing this, made the courageous leap of logic to try the mushroom for himself, a profound transfer of knowledge from the animal world. But animals were not just teachers, they were often tools in these human rituals. We have already spoken of the grim tale of the mandrake root and the dog used to pull it from the ground. This story is more than just a clever harvesting technique. It represents a ritualistic use of an animal as a proxy, a living sacrifice intended to absorb the plant's deadly magical power, sparing the human. The animal became a shield, a vessel for the dangerous forces being unleashed. Even more directly, animals were sometimes used as ingredients themselves. While it sounds gruesome to our modern ears, folk recipes for magical concoctions often called for animal parts. The fat of a pig, or, more sinisterly, a black cat, was a common base for flying ointments. More esoteric recipes might call for the blood of a bat, or the skin of a toad. This was based on the principles of sympathetic magic, the belief that by consuming a part of an animal, one could absorb its essential qualities, like the bat's ability to navigate the night. This belief system connects directly to the folklore of witches' familiars and the power of shapeshifting. A familiar was an animal companion, a cat, a toad, a bird, thought to be a magical servant. The belief in shapeshifting, where a witch could transform into an animal, was also widespread. It is easy to imagine how the powerful, out-of-body hallucinations induced by psychoactive ointments could create the vivid sensation of becoming another creature entirely, of feeling the world through the sharp eyes of a cat or the swift feet of a hare. In the medieval mind, the boundary between the human and the animal was far more porous and mysterious than we see it today. The natural world and all its creatures were imbued with power and meaning. Observing an intoxicated animal or incorporating them into a ritual was part of this holistic worldview. It was a tacit acknowledgement that the world of sensation and the occasional journey into altered states was a territory shared by all of creation, not just by humankind. The words we use have power. They shape our understanding of the world and our place within it. We've spent this time exploring the substances of the medieval world, but now let's explore the language they used to talk about them. They did not have our modern, clinical vocabulary of psychedelics, hallucinogens, or intoxicants. Instead, they drew from a richer and often more poetic well of words from the realms of medicine, religion, and folklore. From the world of medicine came a language of function and effect. A plant that induced sleep was known as a soporific. A potion to dull the senses before surgery was called a soporific draught. The term narcotic was also used, derived from the ancient Greek word for numbness. For a medieval physician, a narcotic wasn't an illicit substance. It was simply a tool to make a patient numb to pain, a valued and necessary part of their toolkit. Religion and mysticism provided the most sublime vocabulary. An altered state of consciousness was never a trip. It was a vision. A feeling of profound, out-of-body joy was an ecstasy, from the Greek ekstasis, which literally means to be or stand outside oneself. It was a rapture, a trance, or a communion. This language didn't just describe an experience, it elevated it, framing it as a holy event where the soul was temporarily lifted from its earthly vessel to touch the face of the divine. In the world of folk magic, the language was one of enchantment. A love potion wasn't called a drug. It was a charm, a filter, or a glamour. That last word is especially revealing. The original meaning of glamour was a magical spell that tricked the senses and made things appear different from how they truly were. To give someone a potion wasn't to intoxicate them. It was to cast a glamour over their eyes, a far more romantic and mysterious notion. But when these experiences turned dark, the language became equally stark and terrifying. A person suffering from a bad reaction wasn't having a bad trip. They were bewitched, possessed, or had been driven mad. The cause was not a chemical, but a curse. The plants themselves often carried a warning in their name. The word bane, which we find in henbane and wolfsbane, is an old word for that which brings death and destruction. There was no ambiguity in a name like that. We also find a great deal of artful vagueness in the written records, especially those penned by monks. An herbalist monk, wary of being accused of promoting witchcraft, might not write that a plant causes powerful hallucinations. Instead, he would use coded euphemisms, writing that a particular herb gladdens the spirit, provokes phantasms, or makes a man merry. This allowed practical knowledge to be preserved without attracting the unwanted attention of a zealous abbot or inquisitor. One crucial word that is largely missing from the medieval vocabulary is addiction. While they certainly observed physical dependence, especially with opium, they lacked our modern framework for understanding it as a medical disease. A person who couldn't stop using a substance was more likely to be seen as having a weak will, a melancholic temperament, or a sinful nature. It was a failure of character, not a condition of chemistry. The language of the medieval world, then, did more than just describe these states. It actively created the container for the experience. Calling a vision a divine ecstasy prepared the mind to meet God. Calling it demonic possession prepared it for a battle with Satan. These words were not just labels. They were the invisible architecture of reality itself, shaping how the journey into the mind was perceived, remembered, and judged. In the rigid, patriarchal society of medieval Europe, one's gender defined nearly every aspect of life, from the work you did, to the rights you held, to the way you were expected to pray. It should come as no surprise, then, that the world of intoxication was also deeply gendered. The way men and women used these powerful substances, the reasons they sought them out, and the judgment they faced for doing so, were often worlds apart. For countless centuries, women were the primary keepers of domestic herbal knowledge. While men wrote the great medical treatises in Latin, it was the women, the mothers, grandmothers, and village midwives, who possessed the practical, hands-on wisdom of the garden. They knew which leaves to crush for a poultice, which flowers to steep for a child's fever, and which roots could soothe a painful ailment. This knowledge was passed down not through universities, but through kitchens and sick rooms, a legacy of female care. Nowhere was this expertise more vital than in the realm of childbirth. This was an experience almost exclusively managed by women for women. Midwives were skilled herbalists, employing a range of plants to navigate the perilous journey of labor. They used sedatives like poppy or henbane to ease the terrifying pain, and other herbs to staunch bleeding or encourage contractions. The use of these powerful psychoactive drugs in this context was seen as a necessary and respected part of a woman's domain over the mysteries of life. At the other end of the social spectrum, we find a use for these plants tied to aristocratic femininity, cosmetics. As we've discussed, Noble women used the toxic plant belladonna to dilate their pupils, creating a look that was considered alluring and beautiful. This was a sanctioned, even celebrated, form of getting high, because it served the purposes of elite beauty standards. The use of a dangerous poison was deemed acceptable. It was a luxury, and therefore it was safe from condemnation. But this very knowledge of plants that could affect life, death, pain, and the mind made women powerful, and in a society deeply suspicious of female power that operated outside the control of husbands, priests, and lords, this power was seen as a threat. The midwife who could use her herbs to safely deliver a baby could just as easily be accused of using them to cause a miscarriage. The woman who could brew a sleeping draught could be accused of concocting a poison. Her healing garden could be reframed as a witch's garden. This suspicion reached its peak with the lore surrounding witchcraft and female sexuality. The stories of flying ointments applied to the body with a broom handle were interpreted by male inquisitors in the most lurid and sexualized ways. The image of the witch flying naked through the night to a demonic Sabbath became a potent symbol of uncontrolled, dangerous female lust. A woman's journey into an altered state was thus conflated with the ultimate sin of consorting with the devil. Contrast this with how male intoxication was often viewed. A group of knights drinking themselves into a stupor might be seen as merely boisterous and uncivilized. A moral failing, perhaps, but certainly not evidence of witchcraft. A monk who experienced a vision after fasting and prayer was hailed as a saint. A Viking warrior who entered a battle frenzy was seen as channeling a divine or primal fury. Male altered states were often framed by concepts of social status, martial valor, or holiness, rarely by the same dark, sexualized magic attributed to women. A profound double standard was at play. For medieval women, the world of herbs was both a source of profound power and immense peril. It gave them the tools to heal their families and control their own bodies, but it also made them uniquely vulnerable to accusation and persecution. The same plant could be a fashionable cosmetic in a lady's chamber, or a damning piece of evidence at a witch trial. It's a stark reminder that in this enchanted garden, the deadliest poison of all was often misogyny. To truly understand the medieval experience of getting high, we must first understand the medieval concept of the head and the heart and the soul. They did not see the mind as we do, as the emergent property of a physical brain operating on electrochemical signals. For them, a person was a far more mysterious and composite being, a temporary union of a physical body, an immortal soul, and a series of subtle spirits that animated the entire system. At the center of this was the immortal soul. In the Christian theology that dominated the era, the soul was everything. It was the spark of the divine, the seat of reason, memory, and moral choice. The body was merely its earthly vessel, a temporary shell of clay. Therefore, any experience that powerfully affected one's thoughts, perceptions, or emotions was, by definition, a spiritual event. It was something happening not to your brain, but directly to your eternal soul, with all the immense stakes that implied. Bridging the gap between the immaterial soul and the physical body were the spirits, or spiritus. This was a medical concept inherited from ancient Greek physicians. These spirits were not ghosts, but a kind of vaporous, life-giving essence that was generated in the heart, perfected in the brain, and flowed through the arteries to give life and sensation to the body. It was believed that strong smells, potent herbs and powerful fumes could directly affect these spirits, making them cloudy, agitated, or serene, thus altering one's entire state of being. Furthermore, for much of the Middle Ages, the heart, not the brain, was considered the primary organ of thought and feeling. The brain was sometimes seen as little more than a cooling organ, a radiator, to keep the hot, passionate spirits rising from the heart from overheating. This is why experiences were described in the language of the heart. A heavy heart for sadness, a gladdened heart for joy. A potion didn't alter your brain chemistry. It worked upon the humors and spirits of your heart. This internal world was also seen as being under constant siege from external, supernatural forces. The medieval person believed the air around them was thick with invisible beings, angels, demons, sprites, and ghosts, all attempting to influence the human soul. An altered state of consciousness, where reason was clouded, was seen as a moment of profound spiritual vulnerability. It was a crack in one's spiritual armor, through which either divine inspiration or a demonic entity could enter. This entire system was nested within an even grander idea that the human body was a microcosm, a perfect small-scale reflection of the universe. The macrocosm, the 7 known planets, the 4 elements, the changing seasons, all had their corresponding parts and qualities within the human person. An herb gathered under the astrological influence of Mars would thus have a fiery, martial quality. A high was therefore not just a personal, psychological event. It was a cosmic one, an experience that temporarily aligned the user with the vast, invisible forces of the universe. When you put this all together, you can see how this worldview would fundamentally script the visionary experience. If you believe your soul can literally leave your body, then a flying sensation induced by an ointment is not a hallucination. It is a. If you believe a demon can enter your mind, then a paranoid and terrifying bad trip is a literal demonic assault. Their beliefs didn't just interpret the experience, they gave it its shape, its texture, and its meaning. Medieval people were not simply misunderstanding chemical reactions in their brain. They were having experiences that were completely real and valid within their own intricate framework of reality. To truly grasp what it was like for them, we have to try, just for a moment, to set aside our modern mechanistic view. We have to see the world as they saw it, an enchanted place, alive with spirits, and balanced between the cosmic forces of heaven and the intimate vulnerabilities of the human heart. There is one altered state of consciousness that every single person in the Middle Ages experienced, from the lowest peasant to the highest king, the dream. But for them, dreams were not just the meaningless, nocturnal firings of a resting brain. They were a channel, a mysterious portal through which messages could be sent. God, angels, and demons could all speak to a person in their sleep. The future could be glimpsed. Therefore, the art of dreaming, and of inducing specific kinds of dreams, was a deeply serious matter. Modern scholars sometimes use the term "onrigen" for a substance that produces or enhances a dreamlike state of consciousness. The medieval world was full of such substances. We have already seen how mandrake was believed to bring on prophetic dreams, and how the delirious states caused by henbane could easily blur the lines between waking reality and a vivid, interactive dream. These plants were keys to unlocking the gates of the subconscious mind. Perhaps the most famous and widely used dream herb in European folklore was mugwort. This common, unassuming plant, Artemisia vulgaris, was renowned for its power over the dream world. It was frequently stuffed into sleep pillows, or burned as a smoky incense in the bedroom just before sleep. The goal was to promote more vivid, memorable, and occasionally lucid dreams, dreams in which the sleeper might realize they are dreaming and even take control. It was a tool for conscious exploration of the subconscious. How exactly did this work? The effects of mugwort are subtle, but its aromatic oils may have had a mild sedative or psychoactive effect when inhaled over many hours. More importantly, however, was the power of ritual and suggestion. The very act of preparing a special dream pillow, of focusing your intent on having a significant dream, would prime the mind to pay closer attention to its nocturnal wanderings. The herb was a physical focus for a mental intention, a catalyst for the magic the mind could already perform. But having the dream was only the beginning. Interpreting its meaning was the true art, and a high-stakes one at that. A king's dream could be seen as a prophecy for the entire kingdom's fate. The Bible itself offered powerful precedents, with figures like Joseph and Daniel rising to power through their unique ability to interpret the dreams of pharaohs and kings. This gave the practice of dream interpretation a level of legitimacy and importance that is hard for us to imagine today. This led to the popularity of dream books, which circulated widely in manuscript form throughout the Middle Ages. The most famous of these was the Somnia Danielis, or the Dreams of Daniel. These books worked like dictionaries of dream symbolism, offering interpretations for hundreds of common dream scenarios. To dream of climbing a ladder might signify honor, while to dream of dark and murky water could mean sickness or distress. It was an attempt to create a rational system for understanding the irrational language of sleep. Dreams were also seen as a vital diagnostic tool. A physician, trying to understand a patient's humoral imbalance, would often ask in great detail about the content of their dreams. A dream filled with fire and anger might suggest an excess of yellow bile. A nightmare could be a direct symptom of a physical malady. The dream, therefore, was a space where the health of the body and the fate of the soul were seen to be intimately and inextricably linked. For the medieval person, the boundary between the dreaming world and the waking world was wonderfully, and sometimes frighteningly, thin. Using herbs to more deliberately step into that world was not mere escapism. It was a form of research, a quest for guidance, healing, and knowledge from a realm they considered to be just as real, and often far more meaningful, than the one they inhabited during their waking hours. Their life was a constant conversation with their dreams. We have journeyed through the realms of magic, medicine, and mysticism. But there is another powerful force that shaped the medieval world of intoxication, one that is perhaps more familiar to us today: economics. The desire for relief, escape, and ecstasy was not just a spiritual or medical matter. It was a business. From the humble alewife to the Venetian spice merchant, the trade in these substances was a vital part of the medieval economy. At the most local level, the economy ran on alcohol. In the early Middle Ages, brewing was often a domestic chore handled by women, the alewives who would sell their surplus for extra income. As towns grew, this evolved into a commercial enterprise, with dedicated taverns, inns, and powerful brewers' guilds. The entire process, from the farmer growing the barley, to the miller grinding the grain, to the brewer fermenting the ale, to the tavern keeper pouring the drink, was a cornerstone of local commerce. The apothecary shop, too, was a place of business. The apothecary was a skilled artisan who turned raw ingredients into valuable products. They might gather herbs from their own garden for free, but through the careful process of drying, grinding, and mixing them into a complex potion, they created a remedy for which they could charge a handsome price. Their expertise was their capital. Expensive and complex concoctions, like theriac, with its dozens of exotic ingredients, were luxury goods available only to the wealthy. The quest for intoxication also fueled the global economy, most notably through the incredibly lucrative spice trade. Spices that we now take for granted, such as black pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, were worth more than their weight in gold in medieval Europe. They were sought after not just for their ability to preserve and flavor food, but for their perceived medicinal and mood-altering properties. According to humoral theory, these hot spices could enliven the spirits and counteract melancholy, making them a kind of luxury upper. The smell of holiness also had a very high price tag. The key ingredients for church incense, frankincense, and myrrh could not be grown in Europe. They were harvested from trees in distant Arabia and East Africa. This precious resin then had to be transported across deserts and seas by long and dangerous caravan routes, passing through the hands of many merchants. The immense cost of incense was a significant and continuous expense for the church, showing just how much economic power a sacred scent could command. The legendary Silk Road was the main conduit for these and other exotic goods from the East. Along with silks and porcelain, this network of routes brought substances like raw opium and cannabis resin, or hashish, into the trading hubs of the Mediterranean. These were powerful, exotic, and extremely expensive, their value increasing with every mile they traveled. Their use in Europe was therefore limited to the very wealthy or to the best-stocked apothecaries in major port cities like Venice or Genoa. And where there is trade, there are taxes. Rulers were quick to realize the financial potential of this commerce. They levied heavy taxes and tariffs on imported goods like wine and spices, and they charged licensing fees to taverns and guilds. This revenue was essential for funding their courts, their governments, and their armies. This economic reality is another key reason why a taxable substance, like alcohol, was officially tolerated, while the untaxable, foraged herbs of the common folk were viewed with suspicion. It becomes clear, then, that every altered state had its price. It could be a simple penny for a cup of ale, a significant sum for an apothecary's sleeping draught, or a fortune for a pinch of a rare Eastern spice. The human desire for a different reality, whether for 5 minutes or 5 hours, was a powerful economic engine that fueled local communities, built international trade empires, and helped to fund kingdoms. The business of intoxication, it seems, has always been profitable. Our long and winding journey through the foggy fields and dim-lit workshops of the medieval world is now drawing to a close. We have traveled from the gardens of European monasteries to the deserts of Persia, from the high seats of Viking seers to the sacred mushroom ceremonies of the New World. Before we finally drift off, let's take a quiet moment to reflect on what we have learned and gather the many threads of this story together. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that the desire to alter one's own consciousness was not some rare or deviant activity. It was a universal human impulse, woven into the very fabric of medieval life. It was present in the peasant's daily cup of ale, the monk's clouds of incense, the noblewoman's cosmetic drops, the soldier's poppy-laced wine, and the healer's sleeping draught. The search for a different reality was everywhere, a constant and fundamental part of the human condition. We have also seen, time and again, how the lines between concepts we now hold as separate were beautifully and dangerously blurred. The line between a medicine and a poison was often nothing more than a few grains on a scale. The line between a divine vision and a demonic hallucination depended entirely on who was having it and who was judging it. And the line between a healing herb and a tool of witchcraft was often just a matter of fear and accusation. This highlights the incredible power of context and intent. A psychoactive substance is never just a chemical. It is a cultural artifact. We saw how cannabis could be a contemplative tool for a Sufi poet, while at the same time being completely unknown or feared in most of Europe. We saw how mushrooms could be the flesh of the gods to an Aztec priest and the work of the devil to a Spanish friar. The plant was the same, but the experience it created was a world apart, shaped entirely by the beliefs of the user. Living in a world without modern chemistry forced the medieval mind to be incredibly creative. Lacking a theory of alkaloids or neurotransmitters, they developed their own intricate systems to make sense of these powerful plants. The doctrine of signatures, humoral theory, astrological medicine, these weren't just superstitions. They were rational, imaginative attempts to find order and meaning in a world that often seemed to operate on pure magic. They were a different kind of science. We must also remember the constant, looming presence of risk. This was not a safe or predictable pastime. From the unintentional agony of ergotism to the accidental foraging of a deadly look-alike plant, from a potion that turned out to be poison to an overdose of a simple sleeping aid, danger was always present. Every interaction with this potent side of nature was a gamble, with one's health, one's sanity, and sometimes one's very soul hanging in the balance. And as we reflect on their world, we can see clear echoes in our own. Today, we are still debating the fine line between medicine and recreation. We are rediscovering the critical importance of set and setting, the ancient idea that context and intention shape the experience. We are once again using these substances to treat melancholy and to seek profound spiritual meaning. Our science has grown, but the fundamental human questions have not changed. Thank you for taking this long journey with me tonight. We have wandered through some of the strangest and most fascinating corners of history. It has been a story of healing and harm, of faith and fear, of divine visions and demonic delusions. In our final part, we will have a few last thoughts before we let the gentle hum of history lull us completely to sleep. And so, our exploration comes to a gentle end. The facts and the stories, the names of the plants and the theories behind their use can now begin to soften and dissolve. Let them fade at the edges, like an old manuscript left out in the sun. There is nothing more to learn tonight. There is only the quiet space that follows a story, a space for rest. The medieval world we have visited was, in its own way, a deeply enchanted place. It was a world where a plant was never just a plant, but a signature from God, where a dream was never just a dream, but a message from another realm, and where an altered state was never just a chemical reaction, but a journey of the soul. It was a reality steeped in meaning, mystery, and magic. Beneath all the strange and sometimes frightening details, we find a simple and timeless human truth. The desire for relief from pain, the search for a connection to something larger than oneself, the yearning for a momentary escape from a harsh reality, these are not unique to any one time or place. They are the threads that connect us, across 1,000 years, to the people who walked these paths before us. Perhaps the best way to remember this world is as a vast and mysterious garden. A garden filled with flowers that could heal and weeds that could harm. A garden of fruits that brought ecstasy and roots that brought terror. The most precious and dangerous knowledge a person could have was how to navigate this garden, how to tell the difference between the cure and the curse, which often grew side by side. So now, let go of the details. Let the names like henbane and mandrake drift away. Let the ideas of humors and spirits recede. Just focus on the sound of my voice and on the steady rhythm of your own breath. There is no need to hold on to the narrative any longer. Allow it to become a soft, meaningless hum, a gentle background to your own descent into sleep. If you have enjoyed our long, quiet journey together tonight, and you would like to explore more of these forgotten corners of the past, please do consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. It would be a joy to have you with us again. But for now, just rest. Thank you, truly, for lending me your time and your attention tonight. I hope this story has provided a small measure of peace and a gentle pathway into your dreams. May your night be calm, your rest be deep, and your own visions be sweet. Sleep well. Good night.